Hello listeners and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, where we bring you the latest news, issues and changes happening in the energy sector. Will COP29 deliver, or will it be a cop-out on a global scale? This episode is split into two parts. The first will focus on the UN Climate Conference and the second on Europe's carbon market, the EU ETS. We're in the second week of COP, and it's fair to say it's been a shaky start. The shadow of fossil fuels has loomed large over the Baku conference. The president of Azerbaijan said in his opening speech that oil and gas were a gift from God. Meanwhile, the G20 group of nations met this week in Brazil and avoided any reference whatsoever to transitioning away from fossil fuels. So what is going on? And will COP29 deliver? We'll also be asking if there are any knock-on effects on EU carbon prices in the months ahead, and the direction of travel and the main drivers. Our carbon correspondent, Jem Bektas, has been following developments on the conference floor at COP29 and has just sent this from Baku.
I'm in Baku, the Azeri capital currently hosting the world's largest annual climate change summit. Parties, observers and media representatives rush to and from plenary rooms, side events and press conferences. Meanwhile, leaders have been meeting to try and progress climate talks behind closed doors. The key item on the agenda has been setting the new climate finance target, and the sentiment here has been somewhat pessimistic and frustrating for many delegates. The central debate here is how much money developed nations are willing to provide developing nations annually for climate action after 2025. This new collective quantified goal, or NCQG as it's known here, would replace the $100 billion a year pledge first agreed in 2009. I spoke with Catherine Pettingell, the Director of Climate Action Network UK, on the status of NCQG negotiations.
So we've been really disappointed that the contributor countries haven't come with really concrete proposals about the money that they're prepared to put forward and what ambitious looks like to them.
As of Thursday, a new draft text was released for NCQG, although it was still missing an agreed target figure for a final goal. And while COP29 draws to an end, it remains unclear what kind of a deal will be reached here. Whatever the outcome for NCQG, COP will still be scrutinised for what it has and hasn't delivered.
Now, I'm pleased to be joined by Trevor Sikorski, Head of Natural Gas and Carbon Research at Energy Aspects. Trevor, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you. Always nice to be here.
So let's focus first of all on the COP. What are the key issues here for the energy sector more generally?
I mean, for energy this time, it isn't the biggest focus. That was dealt with last COP, where there was this a little bit about what could you agree in terms of peaking of energy usage, and it was quite weak when it came out. But I don't think anyone wanted to revisit that because so much time was spent last year. So this year has really been about a few other different things. Some of it about carbon markets. Certainly there was a big component on carbon markets and what are called the Article 6 negotiations. So that's been a big thing. And then the other thing which has really dominated and will continue to probably dominate this week is really discussions about climate finance and the big financial transfers that are expected to happen between the developed world and the developing one.
Yeah, that's certainly the key issues. Why do you think negotiations have been so slow?
It's been a mixed bag, I think. When you look at Article 6, it actually started out quite well with, on the first day, the host government really pushing through a paper which basically approved a bunch of standards for 6.4. This is the real kind of what they call the PACM, or the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, so the actual offset standards that would operate under the UNFCCC going forward under the Paris Agreement. So this was quite a big deal. Now, that had been debated a lot in the last 3 or 4 COPs and never had been agreed. And it was a little bit of a different approach. So the supervisory body who was responsible for putting together stuff pulled together a set of standards that to use for the 6.4 mechanism, and basically said, we've approved this. Now, COP, it's over to you. You can approve this, or you can reopen it and renegotiate it. And the Azerbaijanis just rubber stamped it and said, okay, that's done. We've approved it. A little bit of murmurs, but I think everyone was sick of 6.4 anyway. So it was okay, you've done that. Now, the other component of that, which is more kind of interstate transfers, is on 6.2. 6.2 is a little bit more difficult, but that also seems to be coming together. So it does seem like there's a little bit of a head of steam behind Article 6, maybe where you finish Article 6 at this COP. it allows those markets then to develop. And you move on to bigger ticket items, which are a lot harder. And those harder things really haven't seen very much progress at all. And finance is the hardest.
Absolutely. And for those listeners who aren't aware of Article 6, could you explain it concisely, briefly?
Yeah. Very briefly on Article 6. So Article 6 is the bit of the Paris Agreement that basically allows carbon markets to be a tool for states to meet their obligations. So you can trade effectively emission reductions between states. That's effectively what it's there to do. And it has two components. One, the first component is what's referred to as 6.2, and that's kind of really about the interstate trade of carbon emissions and how that's going to happen. And then 6.4 was a little bit like the clean development mechanism, if you cast your memory back. So it was a crediting mechanism, a kind of offset mechanism that would be managed and run by the UNFCCC, and so it would be very much like the successor to the clean development mechanism, and it's more or less should be agreed, and people are talking about we should start to see 6.4 credits in 2025 and really then being highly operational from 2026 now.
But we're still quite a long way off a global carbon price, are we not?
Yeah, so this is very much more like offsetting mechanisms almost. There's no defined, it's a little bit unclear who's going to be the buyers, if it's just going to be states that are going to be buying this, or whether or not you'd be able to use it. Certainly you'd be able to use those types of credits under things like CORSIA, which is the ICAO aviation emission reduction scheme that's in place. So because that's a UN body, it is defaulting to use these types of credits. So there's some niche things, but there's not it's not hugely clear where a lot of demand is going to come from these. You would see a lot of ESGM money probably wanting to use it, but like you said, it's more kind of that offset mechanism than really saying, and people using it for more voluntary than saying, here's a global compliance carbon price that everyone has to pay.
Absolutely. But then the offset market has certainly had a bit of bad press recently. I think it would be fair to say it's a sort of unregulated space where a lot of trust and integrity has gone. Is this a way of getting that back, getting the offset market back on its feet, and so it becomes a tool that companies, you said environmental, social governments, etc., can use to offset their emissions or become a sort of climate neutral?
Yeah, that's certainly the hope, that this kind of is a reset on a market which really, as you've said, has had a number of scandals about environmental integrity. It has stopped growing. It's maybe getting a little bit smaller, but it's not really taking off anymore. And there's a lot of skepticism. So it is, there's a lot of hope being pinned on this Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. It won't have really, a big pile of unused offsets from a decade ago in it, polluting the offset stream, as it were. So in some ways, it helps reset it. There's also probably a lot learned from some of the scandals that we've seen with the offset market about how to measure some of the key aspects of offsets to make sure they are additional, that they are real, those kinds of things. Is it going to be perfect? It's offsetting. It's probably never going to be perfect, but it is probably going to be an improvement. And it is seen as one of the ways of getting, and this gets back into finance a little bit, but a way of getting private capital into that kind of Paris Agreement emission reduction efforts, mobilizing, much more private capital in that, and really being part of the components of those financial transfers into developing countries, because that's where you will find most of those opportunities for doing offsetting.
This is all occurring against the background, as I mentioned, the introduction of the president of Azerbaijan, who mentioned that oil and gas are a gift from God. You've got the G20 barely making any statement away from fossil fuels, or mentioning fossil fuels even, and you've got the Trump election where he's drill baby drill. What kind of impact is that having on the negotiations and the COP more generally?
I think bringing it back to the finance question, I think it's having a big impact on the finance question, because it's very hard in a world where climate ambition seemed to be somewhat limited, and if anything, going backwards in certain places. It's very hard for the developing world to get the types of financial support they want for emissions, for mitigation and adaptation to climate change. That becomes very hard. And it becomes also hard for the developed world to say, here's a big financial commitment that we're going to undertake, but then we're really unsure how much the US might contribute to that, particularly if, as feared, they come out of the Paris Agreement next year. Right. So all of a sudden, this gaping hole where the United States is supposed to be, and it really is. It is, I think, a real, a tough time to get something as complicated as finance agreed when one of the biggest donors, looks like they're probably going to disappear.
Mm. But it's been criticized as a talking shop, but lots of hot air, but no real decisions. That's not just maybe the case for this COP, but also the previous ones. Is it still fit for purpose, would you say, Trevor?
It is a global problem, and it is the UN. And there are certain principles which you would say makes it more difficult. And certainly that kind of need for effectively what kind of looks like unanimity. And that gets bent a little bit, usually when people just rubber stamp me. And then you need a very strong house to do that. And you might get a few dissenting voices, but generally that kind of carries. But it is looking for widespread agreement on anything that matters. And when you start looking at big questions, it becomes everyone has a slightly different take on it, and everyone has slightly different wants, and it becomes very hard to get a lot of agreement apart from, yes, we must reduce emissions at some point. So I think by its nature, it's a difficult global question. And when you look at how COP's structured, it's all about hearing every voice and making sure everyone's represented, and these are good principles, but it does make getting any type of agreement a lot more difficult. Now, we did see a little bit with 6.4, like having the supervisory bodies basically saying this is agreed, now COP, it's up to you to reject it, as being a way of getting an agreement on something that was taking an awful long time to get agreement on, which was those 6.4 clauses. Some people complained about that, but I think at the end of the day, most people just breathed a sigh of relief that, oh my God, we don't have to talk about that stuff anymore. And I think that's maybe a way of going forward. It feels very hard of reinventing this particular wheel of how you do things on an international basis, because as soon as you stop excluding people, then they're always going to complain that it's not representative, and then you have these issues. It's complicated, it's difficult, it's unwieldy. It's become a little bit of a circus. I mean, if you look back at COPs 10 years ago, you wouldn't, basically everyone had to be accredited. You didn't have this big green zone concept of non-accredited people just showing up because they want to feel like they're at COP. It was basically everyone had to have some degree of blue zone effective accreditation, which of course just limited the number of people. I wouldn't say it made it any easier to get agreement. This has been a long-standing issue with COP, is like, why do you always insist on effectively unanimity? Can't you just push through things? And that being a reasonably difficult thing to do in those types of international negotiations.
So what you're saying then, Trevor, is pretty much that we're stuck with it, and in this format, this concept of unanimity, of inclusion, basically. So there's... it's unlikely that it will be reformed, or that even an alternative would be.
Yeah, I think it's hard. You do have you have the subsidiary bodies, you have the supervisory bodies, you have a bunch of almost a civil service in the UNFCCC that are working on these things in between COPs and trying to. And there's lots of working bodies and workshops and things like this, which are doing an awful lot of work. And then they would take things to COP, which had 15 different positions in it, and it was very hard to not narrow that down. So I think there are ways maybe of just of making decision making a little bit more efficient than it is now. It couldn't be less efficient probably, but a bit more efficient. But I think that as a general forum, it's hard to see what would replace it.
Yeah, and maybe there's a wish for more urgency as well, because around us the world is burning, it's flooding, it's drought. Really, there is a desire for action rather than words, and COP's maybe not the best place for that.
Both the way the Paris Agreement is structured and in reality, what it really needs is domestic governments to really do things, right? And this is where your action is, right? And this becomes the problem, and I would think it's one of the problems that we're living with at the moment, is when you look at the spread of right-wing populist governments around the world, they tend to be quite climate skeptic, and that's really slowing, regardless of what the Paris Agreement's saying, right? That is what is slowing activity on finance. It's really nothing to do with COP, but it's everything to do with individual states and what individual states want to do in terms of their climate ambition. And that's the thing that's begun to slow down quite a bit. And that's often hard when you have difficult economic times, and certainly there's been lots of geopolitical upheavals over the last couple of years that have slowed the global macroeconomy down, and that, it is always harder to be ambitious on things that are going to be expensive when the economy is doing less. And, let's be honest, the energy transition, generally is not going to be cheap.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned Donald Trump, as expected, probably pulling the US out the Paris Agreement, which would leave a gaping hole in the financing of clean energy or decarbonised projects in the developing world. But is there anything of relevance at COP to the EU ETS before we launch into the carbon market discussion here, Trevor?
Yeah, not really. Which is we always go, it's COP time, but it means nothing for the ETS. And this probably just goes back to that previous point, is really about what are states actually doing, right? And so what happens in Brussels is really important for the EU ETS. If it's not happening in Brussels, it's really, on a policy basis, isn't really important for the ETS, right? And you're not really, I don't think the EU is not in a position of coming out and saying this time around, this is what our 2040 target is, right? Because they haven't agreed it yet. They've started the process under the last parliament, but they didn't finish that. It was up to the next parliament, the current parliament, to do that, and of course the current parliament is still just trying to sort out who's going to run the stuff. But we'd expect that 2040 target setting to be done next year. I don't think it's going to throw many surprises out. We probably think it will be a 90% reduction on 1990 targets for the bloc as the climate target. That's going to be important for the EU ETS, because that will determine the longer run cap trajectory under ETS1 and under ETS2, which will start in 2027. So all of those things to play out.
What's happening in Brussels and the corridors of power there, the machinations, and behind in those smoke-filled rivers, maybe not very much smoke-filled rooms anymore, but
vape-filled rooms.
Yeah, exactly, in the European Commission and Parliament. But Trevor, then moving on to the ETS itself and European carbon prices. So we're seeing an uptick in prices. They're touching the 70 euros a tonne. What are your expectations for the coming weeks and months? Could it hit sort of a year high, 2024 high, or are we going to drop below 60 again?
I don't think we're going to drop below 60. I think it's around our fair price that we'd put for the year. The EU ETS market, I think what's been interesting about it this year is fundamentally it hasn't really done all that much in the sense that if you look on the marginal bits, you'd say supply was up, emissions were down. That's never going to be the most supportive set of marginal indicators. But when you look at what was actually happening on a balance basis, it was balanced this year, right? You're maybe plus or minus 10 million tons in terms of the call on surplus or the addition to surplus. Really a little bit dependent on how these next 2 months go. That's how finely balanced it is to whether or not. We will see, like I said, we're going to probably see another 40 to 50 million ton reduction in power emissions. That's a big number. Not nearly as big as what we saw in 2023, but that had a lot of supportive things that was coming into it, supporting that big reduction.
What were those supportive?
It was everything from it being mild, wet and windy, so that was taking stuff down to huge amounts of solar and wind coming in. But with all those big additions to solar and wind, because it was so windy, particularly in Q4 of last year, it had this massive impact on power sector emissions and was driving those down. And this year you're seeing a more normalized kind of slightly below normal, actually, wind speeds going through Q4 so far.
And if this week's weather's anything to go by, it could get cold.
Yeah, and the forecasts are a little bit warmer. But so I think the fundamentals weren't doing very much in terms of, is it adding to surplus or reducing surplus? Is the scarcity of EUAs changing? And you say it didn't really change very much in 2024. But we did see prices trade in a range from like 50 to almost 80, right? So you're looking at a huge trading range for something that basically traded sideways, right? Within that huge range of going up and down and up and down. And what we saw, I think, this year was really the impact of a lot more kind of algorithmic high frequency trading coming in that was really following trends and was following simple indicators and things like this, and would just move very quickly. And so we've seen the CTAs, or the commodity trading advisories, a brand of kind of the investor community that's less discretionary, is more algorithmic, going from being 15 to 20 million tons of net length to 20 million tons of net short over this period, and those 40 million tons swinging helped drive all of that volatility. Now we're in a place, and the discretionary guys starting off the year pretty much net short, because everyone was a bit bearish. Most of that's come out of the market because we are into a place where, we're not quite saying 25 is going to be a massive bull year for the market, but certainly 26 we think probably is a reasonable bull year for the market, because you are going to have an adjustment to supply coming from free allocation. So you're looking at a 26 bull year. People at 24, you're not going to move bullish. At some point in 25, the discretionary guys start going more long, but we're only a couple of weeks away now from the expiry of the debt contract, which is still the one that has most of the liquidity in the marketplace. So we can't see a lot of people swinging that December 24 probably too much in the next couple of weeks. But I think over next year, we would probably expect a lot of volatility again, because the CTAs are still going to be around, but probably a little bit more bias. And we'd think probably a higher average price over 25 than what we've seen over 24.
When you say CTAs, what for those not familiar with that term, what do you mean there, Trevor?
They tend to be hedge funds, right? People with a lot of capital, but people who will trade much more with algorithms as their kind of guiding principles. So they'll have a lot of stuff they tend to be quite highly trend following. When the prices were going down, they would jump on that and they would go down with it. When prices start to go up, then they start to come out of those positions a lot faster than the more traditional speculative trader, which will understand the balances, have a fundamental view, and will hold that fundamental view until something fundamentally changes that. This is much more about driving a lot of volatility and benefiting on that volatility, and that's effectively how they're trading. And we have a nice little quant service which breaks out investor data that comes out of the Commitment of Traders reports and identifies that stuff which looks like it's trading effectively on pattern, so you can get a good handle for what they're doing against what the discretionary guys are doing.
What does CTA actually, what does that stand for?
It's a commodity trading advisor.
Okay.
It stands for.
Okay.
But
thanks for clarifying that. That's the one thing about the carbon market. Certainly there's a lot of jargon and acronyms in there.
Indeed. Although I'd say that there is that kind of, we do see a lot of that kind of CTA trading in a lot of the other markets that are around. So you see a lot of it. TTF this year has had a lot of it for gas. And it's certainly oil, because everyone trades oil. These guys are involved in oil. So that kind of algorithmic trading just becoming, with AI getting better, with those models getting a bit better, you do see a lot more of that coming into the market. And this year, I think it's been a big driver.
And certainly in intraday power markets, ad-day power markets, absolutely, there's huge amounts coming in. We've seen, just this week, I think, that the positions have gone from short to long as well with this kind of investor community, which may indicate exactly what you're saying, that there are expectations of tightness in supply for certainly 26, but 25 being that year when you transition maybe between balance to shortage, if that's a fair way of putting it, Trevor. What should market participants really be looking at? What are the key drivers here? Is it going to continue to be gas? We're in quite a precarious geopolitical situation at the moment, with potential escalation in Ukraine, the gas transit deal, the OMV deal, the Gazprom issue. Is that something that carbon market participants should be looking at? The main thing is the gas, rather than just also obviously the weather and the fundamentals of supply and demand?
Gas is, and I think this ties in a little bit with that algorithmic trading, because you would have in those algorithms certain things which would be stuff that triggers you to do that. And I think one of those things has been the correlation between gas and power, right? So if the TTF's moving, you move it up. If the EUAs are moving, you move TTF up, right? Those kind of relationships probably being there. And that's been very strong this year. We've seen a lot of gas and carbon correlation. Now, in the short term, that's probably going to continue to hold, right? And like you said, I think if you look at gas prices, we've for a long time had as our base case, and we were slightly adamant that Russian gas was going to disappear from the Ukraine on the 1st of January. You know, that's the default. We found other stories around replacing it with Azeri gas or something like that. Logistically and contractually incredibly difficult to do, and we never really bought into any of those stories. Despite a lot of other people
and then some news agencies reporting on it as well.
Exactly, a little bit too vigorously reporting on it. The risk around Russian gas is less, just because it was expected to fall off massively. It default to zero going through the Ukraine anyways on the 1st of January. Now we're not that far away from the 1st of December. So you are looking at, you're looking at 5 or 6 weeks of potential disruption. And you saw with the OMV announcement last week, the market moved a couple of euros, but it didn't go skyrocket because everyone we expected to disappear anyways. It just might be disappearing a month and a half earlier than we expected, which is a lot different than back in July, where it could disappear 18 months faster than expected, right? And that risk has sat there in the market, and it's probably now reasonably well priced in. We have seen the gas continue to flow to a lot of, which I would say, interesting, but there's a little bit of risk, but I would say it's reasonably modest from that. You still have risks around the Middle East, but again, it felt like some of the really big risks, like closing the Strait of Hormuz and stuff like you can almost never see that happening, right? There's always that threat there, very difficult to make that happen. And if Iran really wants to have everyone in the region hate them, that's one of the ways of going about doing it.
Yeah.
You would make an awful lot of enemies in the region as well.
So you think that's been overblown, that threat then, Trevor?
Pardon?
Do you think that threat's been overblown?
I think it's a little bit overblown. I don't think that's, particularly on the gas side, that's probably unlikely to happen on the oil side as well. You have a lot of big powers that would want to stop that from happening. So I think it didn't feel the biggest risk. There was other risks. There was risks around Israeli supply. If you take that out, then you probably increase the Egyptian call on LNG, which again would be a little bit of a risk for European supply. But that's probably a bigger risk if things really escalate. But those kinds of things, they felt bigger, at other times this year than they feel right now. And the Middle Eastern situation feels a little bit quieter.
The final question, really, I'd like to talk to you, Trevor, about is decarbonisation pathways to, in the medium to long term, especially given the growing cancellations of green hydrogen projects. As we mentioned before we started recording, a lot of the projects that have been announced to great fanfare didn't actually receive any FIDs or final investment decisions. And you've got countries such as Germany that have seen the need to balance the grid, balance the system when there is scarcity, when there isn't enough power from renewable sources such as wind or sun, the so-called Dunkelflaute phenomenon that they call it in German. How does that affect decarbonisation going forward, carbon abatement and carbon prices, Trevor?
Yeah, a very good question. We see at the moment we're having this kind of 3-speed transition where you have one thing going really fast, which tends to be renewable power. So you get lots of wind, particularly lots of solar, probably 100 gigawatts over the last 2 years being added in the EU. You look at that, a kind of stagnant power side, and that is causing a lot of problems in the power market. And it has been one of the reasons why carbon prices are probably about 20 euros softer between this year and last year, right? Those are going very fast. Then you have a number of things which are going, let's say, mid-speed. And these tends to be more on the demand side for power, but that's still EVs, which in 24 slightly the kind of growth, particularly of battery only, flattened out a little bit. They've stopped really growing as fast as they did in the last couple of years. And in heat pumps, which again really peaked in 2022, slightly less in 23, and then probably slightly less again in 24. So technologies which have seen a real growth but are stagnating. And I think for EVs, what you really have to get right is just the cost of capital. You need to get those things cheaper to get them into more parts of the automobile market. And probably with heat pumps, you are getting it slightly out of that world of early adopters and getting it more to be a kind of default solution for a lot of people, which it still isn't in a lot of countries. And then you have things which aren't going at all. And those, again, tend to be on the power demand side. So if you're looking at electrolytic hydrogen, we haven't seen really any FIDs in that, as you've just said. And that's problematic. So that's not going. So that's not adding very much in terms of power demand. And you're not seeing very much in terms of CCS, not that much of a power story. But again, we're not really seeing a huge amount of FID going into CCS at the moment, despite a lot of European money being designated to both CCS and hydrogen, and we're just not really seeing them going out. But what that's doing is creating this kind of very imbalanced power system where the power demand components of the transition aren't showing up very quickly, but the power supply components of that are showing up really quickly. And you are getting these imbalances, and they are a symptom, as you were saying, of things to come in this market, right? Because if you continuously add supply and demand doesn't start to increase quickly, then of course what you end up doing is you end up really crushing spreads, and we've seen that compression already. Very hard to keep coal and gas commercially on the system, right? And the only way you keep them on the system is if you give them some ancillary revenue for backup. This current part of the transition hasn't been particularly supportive for carbon prices or anything like that, because you're seeing demand growing a little bit from EVs and heat pumps, but not really very much, and nothing from the other components. But we are just getting these huge amounts of supply. So it is. I think that's a real, and what it's doing, of course, that compression in power and all of those kinds of things. Now, does that turn around? It has to turn around at some point, and if it doesn't, then the backdrop of all of that is the carbon market, right? And if you still say we're still going to run with a reasonably high level of industrial fuel use without that being abated, and we're going to run with very high levels, not very high levels, but we're still going to run with a lot of unabated gas for balancing, all of a sudden these very low caps that the EU ETS is expecting by 2039, 2040, 2041. Around there is when you get to a zero cap. And then all of a sudden, how does that balance, right? And then all of a sudden you need these very high carbon prices to either get people to do a lot of CCS or a lot of direct air capture or something, or even starting to invest more heavily in these other technologies like hydrogen, which at the moment are just commercially not ready and need a lot of investment on all aspects of that value chain to make work. And that's why they haven't really happened yet, because it is far more complicated than just building solar panels, where you need a whole lot of stuff to happen to make those work, and that's really difficult. And so you have this world where actually you could have reasonably low power prices, and particularly at some point when gas is not setting the power price in very many hours, but you could have really high carbon prices, right, as a backstop to say, look, we have to get rid of everything that's emitting. And that's going to be an interesting kind of battle to see.
But, as you say, Trevor, it's probably, I don't know if it's easier, but it's certainly, in the long run, it would be much cheaper and more effective to get started now rather than wait to 15, 16 years down the line when it's going to be much, much more expensive and hard to achieve as well, I think. So it's better to start early doors, as they say.
It is, but and I think it's an interesting point, because socially, and this is probably what Fit for 55 and Repower is all kind of, will put a lot of money available, but even, a lot of these things not taking FIDs and cancelling are things which have received quite significant levels of promised finance. And even then, commercially it looks undoable. And this is the problem with being the first mover there. So the first mover, you have it's a lot more expensive than if you wait for that technology to become commercialized, and then all of a sudden that's a lot easier to invest in. Unless you're manufacturing this stuff, you don't get benefits from being the first mover. You just get additional costs.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very complex and obviously very daunting. Thank you very much, Trevor. It's great to have you back on the pod. I could keep discussing this for hours, but I think we have to draw it to a close. But thanks very much, Trevor. Great to have you back. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Richard.